A historic Louisiana plantation burned to the ground this past week, and it has left the public divided. Some are celebrating the demise of this emblem of American slavery and plantations, and others are mourning the loss of a historic structure. And it has left people divided after this 18th century mansion had burned to the ground in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And
Yeah.
this is the Nottoway Plantation, also known as the White Castle.
Yep. Yeah. Now this plantation is a very big plantation. It's in what would have been prime plantation real estate back in the days when plantations were a thing. And this destruction here really raises the question of where do plantations sit in the narrative of American history? And also, what should we do with these structures? Because, like it or not, Sherman did not get all of them when he marched to the sea.
Which honestly is a bit of a shame, personally. But
Yeah.
the plantation is roughly 25 miles from Baton Rouge and was billed as the largest antebellum home still standing in the American South.
Yep. And it's really interesting how how the debate around its history has played out. Because on the one hand, you have the argument that this is the largest antebellum home still standing in the South. You have the argument that plantations, however dark of a history they represent, still represent history, a history that should not be repeated and thus cannot be forgot, and we must not allow it to be forgotten. And then on the other hand, you have what they were using it for, which was a wedding venue.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's a lot of arguments that get used for the World War II various camps that doesn't really apply here because the the place isn't being used as a memorial to the horror. It's being used as a romanticism of the times.
It goes to show that a lot of historic properties have these very complex, multifaceted histories, and it does go to show. While I don't think an emblem of those times should be venerated, I don't think it should be celebrated. It is important to learn from it, to be able to walk amongst its halls, to be able to understand the human capital that went into the building. You
Yeah.
know, hundreds of people came through the plantation and worked there under horrible conditions. And some places, people lost their lives. I mean, it is really an important, heavy place. And
Yeah.
it's also just very interesting because, yeah, the fact that they had really been using it as a wedding venue, and they really wanted to talk about how he wants to move forward on a positive note and not going to dwell on the past racial injustice,
Yeah.
aka move on from the history and not talk about it, not mention it, not use it, just
Yeah.
continue on.
Yeah. There's not a lot of plaques or memorials or anything to it. And like that's really where that's really where the historical and societal value of a structure like this exists, is in showing people the how and why that human beings live this way. Because it's very hard to understand why someone would do what is necessary to run a plantation until you walk among the halls and hear about the history of it and begin to see that by being absolutely horrible, they got to live like gods. And that's something few people have the power to resist.
And not every plantation either is being used in this celebrated fashion. Whereas Ashley Rogers, who's an executive director of the Whitney Plantation in Wallace, Louisiana, is trying to confront the past injustice. And the memorial at the Whitney Museum recognizes hundreds of people who were enslaved there, and they talk about the punishments that the slaves faced, and they do not allow weddings on its grounds. So
Yeah.
it's a different approach to a similar problem. It's one of the ways you can see a positive, well, a better usage of the space and of the property.
Yeah. And I get the initial instinct looking at some of the photos. Like if you had no context for what this building is, if the architecture and the location gave away nothing to you, you might say, yeah, this is a very beautiful, luxurious location. It's very picturesque. You can see why it might be a destination or resort type venue. However, once you understand, because you can see at a glance what it is, once you understand what that is, the fact that you do not recoil from that and start to think maybe this isn't the most moral use of this property, that's when I start to worry about the human race.
Well, and when the fire occurred on social media, primarily Twitter and on threads, a lot of people were mourning the loss of the property because they had an emotional connection to it, having been the location of field trips when they were younger, having been their wedding venues or their anniversary venues. And it shows a level of whitewashing of history, and it's purposefully intended on excluding to the human capital and trying to rewrite that narrative. This is one of the biggest attacks on history in general. You have to acknowledge the good and the bad. And this is really interesting, and the owner has already stated on numerous times that he is trying to rebuild the property and is going to put every effort in place to do so. And a lot of people are questioning it because why re-erect a symbol of something that hurt so many people?
Yeah. Especially if you're not using it as a warning. You know, never again is the line that gets used for a lot of these places of very dark history when they get preserved and promoted to the public. And that is the furthest thing from the intent here at Notaway.
And one of the interesting things that I think is the fact that it also goes on to talk about a different project that is in place that is really showing the difference in how plantations are run even today, where Joe Banner, along with her twin sister Joy, acquired two pre Civil War properties, including the Woodland Plantation in St. John the Baptist Parish, where in 1811 a slave revolt had originated. And what they're doing is they're not using them as wedding venues, but instead they're using them as an educational tool to teach the history that they were a fundamental part of. And that is really at its core value. That is what I think historic preservation should really be about, is about preserving the history, the education. Maybe in some ways I do understand the need to use properties in a more non-traditional context to keep them open and to keep them funded and working. But to have weddings, I think is just kind of, it really is not a good look, especially to many of the descendant communities that live in the nearby area still.
Yeah. And like the one thing I will say that Notaway did right is the thing that is crucial for all of art and history, regardless of its nature, and that is creating a strong emotional connection between a population and the art or history. Now, they've gone about doing that in what I think we here are going to condemn as a pretty unethical way.
Yeah.
That's the one positive in all of this. And I say that because we really do need a positive to come out of Notaway before we just start calling for the next fire. I
Yeah.
mean, God's got plenty of thunderbolts.
Well, anyways, we didn't start the fire, and if you let us know what your thoughts are down below, and we will see you guys in the next video.